This gets me thinking about art and what we think of as art. And a lot of people just think, well, if someone grabs a pencil or a crayon and draws it on paper, that's art. I myself, obviously there's the issue of every person of just being able to creatively express themselves. But as far as a work of art, I'm curious how you would define that, and if you consider comics as art, or at least if they can be, and if so, what lifts them to that level.
Yeah, well, I don't see why they can't be art. I mean, they are a valid and discrete and kind of particular form of human expression. So if human beings can make art through a variety of mediums, I don't see why comics can't be one of them. I mean, a lot of comics art has been purely commercial. It just, what do the people want? Just crank out more of that. But the interesting thing is, and again, I'm going to go off on a tangent here, Chris. You very kindly sent me some examples of what you're working on at the moment, which I think I'm okay to say is incorporating famous images into a comic book narrative. And I've actually just finished reading a very, very interesting book by David Hockney and Martin Gayford called A History of Pictures. And it goes through pictures from cave paintings up to movies. And it's really interesting that a lot of the people we thought of as the great masters were the commercial illustrators of their time. Not only that, they used all the aids to cheating which commercial artists have used until this very day. They would project images, they would use mirrors to capture information. They would trace round a projected image before finishing it. So when you look at, and they would do it for money, and they would do it for commission. It just so happened that what was being commissioned in those days were religious paintings, so that gives them a certain gravitas, that is connected to the cosmos and things that are supernatural. But that has been looked upon for many, many centuries as fine art. This is really fun. These are the masters. They were commercial artists whose work happened to survive. And so I don't think there's anything about work being commercial, having a commercial aspect that stops it from sometimes being sublime artwork. I was talking about Will Eisner and Harvey Kurtzman. They were cranking comic books out, but they did it so much better than so many of their peers. They gave it that touch of genius. They gave it that touch of irreplaceability. What they did couldn't have been done by just anybody. So, and I think that's so with comics in general, that inevitably a lot of it is feeding the sausage machine, but in it, there is still the possibility to do something that has a dimension that elevates it into what you could truly call art.
So what would you say art, what is it that we're aspiring to?
Don't ask me what art is.
What are we aspiring to create? If we want to create art, like do you think of your work in, I want to create a masterwork, or are you just, I need a paycheck, I need to get a job out? I know you're probably somewhere in between there, right?
I have to enjoy it. I have to enjoy the collaboration, or I have to enjoy the novelty of what I'm doing. I mean, I have done stuff where I've just cranked it out, and I have, like everybody, I've worked on scripts that have been less than wonderful. But the funny thing is, actually, when you've got a script that isn't particularly good, you think to yourself, there's nothing I can do to make this worse. The only way is up. So I'll do whatever I like, because whatever I like is going to improve it. And I've found some of my creative breakthroughs have happened on not particularly good scripts, but some of the work that I'm proudest of and that I would think I could hold up and say, we went one step beyond for this, is stuff that has got a more something to do with the personality of it. I think with good comics you get a really strong sense of a creative personality, or you have something that you thought you knew illuminated in a completely different way, in the way that art takes the real world and shows it through a different pair of eyes a pair of eyes that has a unique vision and does something to reality that is unique and special. I mean, you know, as I say, I feel like I'm trying to define art, and that's a real trap. You know, art is whatever the hell you want it to be, really.
Yeah. So talking about the artist, this sounds like a great book by Hockney. I'm going to have to look that up. Neil Adams was talking with me a little about tracing and how, you know, it's looked down on. But he was saying if you look at a lot of these masters like Vermeer, you know, his paintings were always near a light source. And Neil was saying that that was because then he could hold his paper up to kind of trace shapes. And that's why they were so dark. And so you look at these masters, you look at people today and it's like, oh, that guy traces. But then you think, well, look at these masters. Or, you know, oh, this guy, he's just creating schlock and pumping it out. Well, what about Munch, who painted the Scream, you know, a half dozen times because he knew it sold? Or Degas, you know, he would, oh, here's a little sketch of a ballerina for you, you know.
Yeah. Sure. No, I mean, I think that has always been the way. I mean, Vermeer is a really interesting case, and there's a wonderful film that I would direct you to. It's called Tim's Vermeer, and it's produced by Penn and Teller, who are wonderful magicians. But it's about this guy who set out to paint a Vermeer painting, and along the way he discovered a feasible technique for the way that Vermeer did it, to get not only everything in the right place, but to get the colors accurate as well. And it's a wonderfully scientific way to do it. And the minute you've seen it done, and he's, well, I mean, I won't give it away, but, well, I will give it away. He paints a Vermeer. It has all the quality of a Vermeer, basically. I mean, I learned to draw by tracing and copying. And the interesting thing about there's an interesting tracing technique that I pass on for anybody who happens to be watching this that's interested. Is if you take a comic book page, you know, either printed size or bigger if you can get it, by one of your favourite artists, get a big sheet of tracing paper, put it over it, and with a really blunt pencil or a really fat marker, just trace the big shapes, just trace the big forms. And you'll be amazed if you look at that. And I've done it actually with a Neil Adams page. You look at it and you think, that's a Neil Adams page. Because it's not in the little noodly details. The little noodly details are the least important thing. What's important are the big shapes. And the way that Neil Adams starts a page before he gets to the noodly bit is by drawing the big shapes. So what you're doing is you're replicating the actual process, and you're actually teaching yourself the importance of the larger composition and the relative lack of importance of the little noodly bits of hatching underneath somebody's nose. So, yeah, and artists have always used reference. There's this weird thing, if you read the Hockney book, there's this real in the closet kind of thing, where some of the most vociferous opponents of optical aids were actually the ones that were using them the most, but it just kept it secret. So it's a fascinating story, and it is a book. If you're interested in the history of pictures and the production of pictures, I really recommend it. It's called A History of Pictures, David Hockney and Martin Gayford, and it's quite recent. I think it came out last year. And there's another interesting book by Hockney called Secret Knowledge, which is explicitly about optical aids to painting and drawing. So, you know, you might find that interesting as well.
Great, yeah. So I'm just going to say one more thing, because I know you've been so generous with your time. I want to talk about the EC library you've got behind you there. Ever since you brought it up, I realized, oh yeah, there it is. And I grew up on mainstream comics, and that EC library there is my first experience with no color in my comics, where in that I saw it and went, wow, look at these lines. You know, the line work was just so amazing. It blew me away. And that was the first set of work I saw. This does not need color to be beautiful and stunning. And as you know, they've since republished them in color. But I've held on to my black and whites of those. Those taught me so much.
Well, it's strange. This is a recurrent thing as well, that in the UK we didn't originally get American colour comic books. We would get black and white English reprints. So my first exposure to the DC comics and Superman and Batman was in black and white reproduction. So I was used. That was how I thought comics should look. And another thing I got hold of when I was growing up were the Ballantine book reprints of Mad Comic, you know, the ones with Super Duper Man and Batboy and Rubin and Flesh Garden and all those great things. And they were just like a paperback book that would have one bank of pictures on each page. And at that point, I had no idea that as well as Mad Comic, there were also, you know, Tales from the Crypt and Amazing Science Fantasy and all the other wonderful, you know, and I think my head would have exploded if I'd seen that. But the interesting thing there is when Russ Cochran reprinted Mad, because it was Mad, they did their mainstream printing of it as a coloured version of Mad. And I actually went to some expense to get the very limited black and white edition they did, because that to me was how Mad Comics should look. And indeed, as you say, it really brings the artwork out. Of course, we've got other wonderful things nowadays, and I thought we might have been talking about this, although we didn't. You know, there's these things.
Ooh la
these
la.
artist editions. And I don't know if you've got this, you must surely have seen it.
I have seen it.
Of original art size repros of Kirby's Crazy Monsters. I was just to end on the note of Kirby Monsters. Shall I just say something about Kirby
that
Monsters?
That would be great. I'd love it.
And then we'll wrap it. The thing I used to love about them was they were so predictable, those stories. You know, so there's all the beats that you know they're going to hit, but the one that sticks in my memory was, it was called, and I actually looked it up online. It was called I Who Created Meccano, Mechano. And basically the story is, there's this old inventor and he creates this robot, this wonderful robot, with the help of his young assistant. And they take it to the state fair and it starts to walk about. But then there's a malfunction in a diode and it goes into destructive mode and it smashes down the state fair. And, you know, all the Kirby cops are firing their guns at it and people are running away. And the old inventor, of course, gets caught up in it and dies in the boy's arms, and the boy races off after Meccano's now headed towards the woods. So that's enough for a story. By now we're 12 pages into a 15-page story. But then on page 13, in the woods, a flying saucer lands, and it may be the stone men from Saturn again, for all I know. And it lands, and the invading stone men get out and say, "Oh, this planet is good. This planet shall be our next prize." When through the woods comes the rampant Meccano, followed by the kid, and the rampant Meccano smashes into these aliens, all watched by the kid. And the aliens say, "Hey, if the inhabitants of this planet are like this, we will never beat them. Let's go." And they get back in their flying saucer and off they go. Meccano falls to the floor, finally out of power. And only this kid knows that the robot monster that was reviled and hated for what it did at the state fair actually saved mankind. That to me is the lunacy I love of the whole monster kind of thing. And there were other stories that did equally mind-bending things, but to have the alien invasion being an afterthought on page 13 is just genius, isn't it? Anyway, I had to say something about Marvel Monsters because I know they're so dear to you.
And I think that storyline was at least 3 or 4 times in the making as well.
I'm sure. Well, if you've got a good story, use it.
Yeah, I'm so glad you shared that monster story. David, it's always such a damn pleasure to see you and get to visit with you. And I hope that this was fun and that I didn't ask the usual questions you are so often probably stuck in the rut answering. So
it was great. I've really enjoyed the conversation, Chris. It always is a pleasure to talk to you. I'm very happy to do this because I've made myself laugh, even if I've not made anybody else laugh. So I hope your viewers out there enjoy it as well.
Yeah,
And
thanks so much.
let's do it again one time soon. But this time, let's concentrate on the Marvel monsters.
Okay, I'm sorry I let you down. Yeah, I let you down on our interview today. And so we'll talk about the Marvel monsters and psychology and what I've learned from my wife.
It's a date.
Okay.
All right, Chris. Stay in touch. Speak
You
to you
too.
soon, I hope.
Yeah, sounds
Bye
good.
for now.